Hey there, y'all, and welcome back to another episode of Reading Rural, y'all. I'm Dr. Shay Parton, your host, and with me today is Michelle Coles, author of Black Was the Ink, an amazing and excellent book, and hoping to talk a little bit about it today. But first, I want to tell you a little bit about Michelle. So she is a debut novelist. She is an experienced civil rights attorney and mother of four. She's a ninth generation Louisianan and is highly attuned to the struggles that African Americans have faced in overcoming the legacy of slavery and the periods of government sanctioned discrimination that followed. She's a proud alumna of Howard University School of Law and the University of Virginia. Her goal in writing is to empower young people by educating them about history and giving them the tools to shape their own destiny. She lives in Maryland with her family. Her debut young adult historical fiction novel, Black Was the Ink, was published with 2 books, an imprint of Leon Lowe Books on November 2nd, 2021. So welcome, Michelle. I'm so excited that you're here with us today.
Thank you. Thanks for inviting me on. I'm excited to talk with you.
So the first question that I always ask everyone is sort of my obsession. Tell me a little bit about your background, where you're from, and how you feel that's impacted and shaped who you are as both a person and a writer.
Yeah, so my background, I'm from Baton Rouge, Louisiana, and both sides of my family are from Baton Rouge going back many generations. My mother's side lived in the city of Baton Rouge, and so I kind of always saw her as like the city girl. And my dad's side, they lived more in the outskirts, like maybe a half an hour north of Baton Rouge, in a more rural area called Zachary. Zachary's gotten more developed now in recent years, but back when my dad lived there, it was a lot of farmland and wide open spaces. And my grandparents had a farm with a giant bull that I'm trying to remember the type of, I think he was a Brahman bull because he had the big hump in his back. And his name was Jason. And he was like a part of the family because they got Jason when he was so young that they literally bottle fed him. And so, like, my dad had a bunch of brothers and sisters, and Jason was like the youngest brother and sister. And, my grandparents had horses and goats and chickens and, grew all of their own vegetables and had a corner store as well. And so I would spend most of my time in the city in Baton Rouge, but on weekends we would go visit my grandparents. And so then I would get to experience and enjoy the country life and, become a complete tomboy, climbing trees and everything else. And so I feel like my identity has always been a little split between, whatever you think of city folk and then, someone that just really enjoys nature and being completely, at ease with oneself and one's environment and and having a good sweat and a good time. So yeah, and then we left Baton Rouge actually when I was in elementary school for my mom's job, and we relocated to Dallas. And so I ended up growing up in the Dallas area and in mostly in a suburban experience. And then, as you mentioned, I went to college in Charlottesville, Virginia. And so that was more like small town America. And then I went to law school at Howard, which was like big city life. And I did a year after law school in Manhattan. So even bigger city life, which wasn't really for me. So that's why it was only a year. Yeah, and then I came back to the DC area. And so I've kind of, found that to be a happy medium for me being in like the kind of the suburbs, like outside of DC, where I'm close enough that I can like go in and experience what, the museums or the restaurants or the cultural things that I enjoy, but then still being able to like back away from it and, have a little more distance from neighbors and a little more space.
So, how do you feel like all of those experiences, especially moving across those different places, have impacted the way that you choose what to write about? for example, in Black Was the Ink, there is a transaction of places where Malcolm starts out in the DC area and then he ends up on his family farm in Mississippi. So do you feel like your background sort of played a role in
Yeah.
how you chose to write that story, and how do you feel like that the interplay exists there?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, for one thing, I think living in all of those different settings and meeting so many different people from so many different places, it helps me relate to a lot of different people in from different backgrounds, and it helps me see past just whatever like surface stereotypes might be ascribed to certain, types of people or groups of people, where you really get to see all the things that you have in common, and starting from that place of commonality and how much everyone loves their grandma, and a good piece of cornbread, or whatever it is. Like, there's so many more things that I think we all have in common than what divides us. And I think when you get that type of exposure, it helps you see that. And in my story, it was in some ways autobiographical in certain respects. As you mentioned, the main character Malcolm, he is a teenager in DC, in an urban setting, where he has some experiences that make his mother feel very afraid for his safety. And they're experiences that I think are fairly common for African American youth living in an urban setting, where one, he's playing basketball at a not a basketball stadium, a basketball court. That's the word. He's playing basketball at a basketball court, and some troublemakers come and a shootout happens. And he's, fleeing from these random bullets on a basketball court through, no fault of his own. But then when the police show up to investigate the shooting, they don't know who's at fault. And so they end up pulling a gun on him and his friend because they're the, last people left behind. And so we've all seen in the news how many Black guys have ended up on the wrong side of that situation as well. And so his mother, becomes very alarmed. And so she decides to send Malcolm to stay with relatives on a family farm in Natchez, Mississippi. And so I think that's kind of like how I experienced my summers, going back and forth between the city life. It wasn't an urban city life, but a more city life in Baton Rouge, and then experiencing that rural environment. And it was an adjustment for Malcolm because that wasn't something that he'd really experienced before. The lack of air conditioning and the farm work, and how difficult that is when you're not accustomed to it. And even though he considered himself a strong kid, he hadn't baled hay before. And so it takes a different mental strength, I think, to do some of those activities. And at first he really disliked it. And I remember, I have a lot of positive memories on my grandparents' farm, but I also remember like laying in bed sweating at night. And it's like, why don't they have air conditioning? Or like if there was a hole in the window screen and the mosquitoes are getting in, like things like that, where it takes some getting used to before you're sometimes able to fully appreciate that experience. And then another thing with Malcolm is because he grew up in DC, he didn't know that side of his family. And so he had all these cousins that all knew each other. And that's how it was for us in Baton Rouge, because my family had been there for so many generations. We definitely were extremely close with all of our first cousins, and that's like 40 people. Like really, like we're at all each other's birthday parties. Like we always say, we didn't have friends, we had cousins. Like that is who came to our birthday parties. But we also were very close with our second cousins, and I'm also close with some of my third cousins, and because they're my grandma's first cousins, and they all still live there. And so you're able to have those really tight bonds across generations. But when you're the family that leaves that nucleus, people just don't really know you, and you don't know them. And so there's that disconnect, even though they're still family. And so I wanted Malcolm to reconnect with that family that was there for him, that he didn't even know was there for him.
Yeah. And I think one of the things that struck me in reading the book was all of the different facets that you managed to capture and how they connect to place and movement across places. So like there's this there's an interesting interaction between like the country as safety, right? Malcolm leaving the city for the country, like because it's safer there, but is it really?
Yeah.
Which there's a couple of, you know, scenes in the book that sort of make you question that.
Yeah.
And then also like all of the decisions that are being made when Malcolm goes into the past, that end up affecting his present in the country are made in DC, in the city,
Yeah.
which is, you know, a city in the time of Reconstruction, which is a different type of city than what DC is today. It's more of a
Yeah, it was
rural
kind of
city.
rural city.
Yeah. And Malcolm talks about that. And I just really appreciated like that. I think it's so easy to treat like rural urban as this like binary, but that's false. It's a false binary, and there's so much interaction and so much interplay,
Mhm.
especially if you consider time. And so I
Mhm.
just really appreciated how you treated that with a lot of nuance and complexity that I don't feel like we often see, because it's just so much easier to be like, this
Black and
took
white.
place in the city or this
Yeah.
took place in the country, and then like sort of making these stereotypical assumptions
Right.
about those places, which Malcolm does sometimes, and
Right.
Jasmine has to say like, whoa bro,
Yeah.
like just a second now, you don't live here, you don't know, you know.
Right, right, right. Yeah, absolutely. And I think it also, shows the potential of the relationship with Jason, who is a white character that lives in the, more rural setting in Natchez, and, was hanging out with a group of guys that were making decisions that he didn't necessarily agree with, but he didn't necessarily also feel, empowered to stop or stand up to.
Mhm.
And so Malcolm initially is going to group him with the people that wronged him, and then they're able to, move past that and see each other as individuals and learn, from each other's stories, and both kind of have an evolution and understanding in how they see the other person.
Yeah, yeah, there's there's so much in Black was the Ink. um so many things to consider, and so many layers. Like that's the other thing, like I really appreciate the intersectionality that exists in this book, because as we were talking about before I pressed record, they're just I mean, rural stories are hard to find in YA anyways. I'm hoping that we're kind of, there's sort of an uptick in people publishing, especially realistic fiction, rural fiction. I feel like rural tends to be a little more represented in horror fiction because of sort of like the isolation and how that can play into that genre.
Yeah,
um
it should be in romance. It's so romantic.
you know, I read a really great rural romance by Sarah Byron.
Okay.
um and I'm not gonna, Bend in the Road, I think is the title of the book. It was so good. And it's actually one of the most rural salient books that
Oh,
I've read, because it's sort of another like, we want to keep the farm, but are we going to get to keep the farm kind of story,
right.
which is happening with corporate farming and stuff like that. Like it happens so much, or the city, eminent domain, the sort of story that you're
Yeah.
talking about in Black was the Ink. But it actually
Yeah.
even happened to my family, which I didn't realize.
Yeah.
My mama, her farm, the water company, took over her farm when
For
she
a
was like,
bill.
and like she was in elementary school.
Oh,
But like it was the city sort of claimed, because I think it was the city water company, and they
yeah.
claimed eminent domain, and they
Yeah.
took up a whole bunch of land out there, and
Yeah.
hers was one of it. And she the thing that makes her the most mad is that to drive by there now, they never even did anything with it.
Yep.
So the
That's,
house is still standing, it's just covered in, ivy,
she's
and
like, that's my house.
right,
Yeah.
right, you
That's the
took it away
same.
from me, and what did you do with it?
What did you
Nothing.
do with it? Yeah, that's actually two situations in my family where I mentioned the book's kind of autobiographical. One was our home was taken to build the interstate, which is what happens
Hmm.
in Black was the Ink. And they they actually, it was in Baton Rouge, and they the original people that like did a study for how to plot the interstate, it had a safer like curve to it, but it would have gone through a white neighborhood. And so they ended up like creating a much like sharper curve, like a sharper turn, and they went through the black neighborhood instead. And so they took like, everybody's, all my grandparents and their cousins and everyone's home, but they also made the interstate less safe. And so at this particular curve where my family's neighborhood was, cars routinely flip over the edge, like, and like land in a, for some reason they put a children's playground underneath this really unsafe car. It's just like,
Just
yeah,
layers of bad.
just layers of bad. And then we also had land that was taken to make a spillway for hurricanes. And so that land we still own, but we're not allowed to build any permanent structures on because it could be flooded at any moment when, if they need to. So, our family will still like hunt on it and gather pecans from the pecan trees, but we can't use it. So,
yeah. And so like, there are so many layers of like of race and class and these kind of things that I just didn't really ever think about as part of like my history. Like I never knew that about her farm. It's not something that was really, I mean, I definitely understand that it happens, but I never thought it happened to me, and that's probably a huge part of my privilege.
yeah. How it's impacted, how it impacted your grandmother, and how that impacted, the people that she raised, which includes the people that raised you. And it's just kind of like how that
it's
trauma
generational
experience, everything else gets passed down and carried down. And, maybe she has a certain distrust of, I don't know if she has a distrust of government, but maybe she does. And maybe it's influenced, by, they took my house. And, you can see how it really has wide reaching effects.
Yeah, absolutely. And so I just felt like I really connected to that because I learned about it while I was reading this book. So it was just like,
Wow.
it's just like perfect timing because I was running a folk writing workshop at my parents grew up in the same tiny Indiana town. And so I ran a folk writing workshop at the library there. And my Emanuel came and I learned about this chapter that my great grandma wrote in a book that was about Noblesville, Indiana, which is where they're from. They're near Noblesville, Cicero. But anyway, so like all of these things, and there are narratives of class injury in there that I never knew about, that I didn't, just stuff that I feel like I've always sort of like felt and experienced. And I grew up pretty working class too, but it's weird because we moved into the middle class as I was like moving into college. And so I just feel like this strange like liminality of like, what is my identity sort of thing.
Right.
But anyway, so this book and sort of that scenario and everything that happens, I just learned a lot. I learned a lot about not only just the history of Reconstruction and, rebels and all of these people that I never knew existed, and all the work that they did for Black folks, and then how it was just like squashed by white supremacy. So much of that I didn't know because I feel like we don't really focus on. I mean, I know the term Reconstruction. I knew sort of like about like when the time period took place, but when I think back to like my American history class, like in high school and even in
like
college,
maybe a paragraph, like it was maybe like if you talked about the Civil War, and there was probably like a little side paragraph was like, and then there was this 8-year period of Reconstruction.
Exactly.
Moving on.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And what's funny is that I think the reason I even remember that there was a Reconstruction is because on SNL, when Mike Myers was on there and he would do the verklempt lady, I can't remember her name, but she would get like worked up, and then she would give you a topic, right? And
Okay.
one of the topics was the radical reconstruction was neither radical nor reconstruction. Discuss.
Really?
Yeah. And so then when I was reading this, I started thinking about that, and
Was that with
it just
Dana
brought a
Carvey?
new layer to that comedy, right?
Was that what was Dana Carvey he wasn't the woman, or
No,
Mike
he was
Myers was
church
the
lady. This
okay,
one
he was
was Mike Myers.
okay, okay. That's so
Yeah.
funny.
Yeah, he played this like, New York bubby, and if he would get a little verklempt in his character, he would always, and one of them was like, a thigh master is neither a thigh nor a master.
Oh
Discuss.
my god.
But that one was less heady, that
Okay,
was less
okay,
intellectual.
okay.
But the radical reconstruction was neither radical nor a reconstruction. Like that
Yeah.
really, it always stuck with me, but I didn't really know why. And then when I started reading this book, I was like, man,
Wow.
like that is so, that was such a smart, that's such smart comedy, and it just was totally over my head as a kid.
Totally. Totally. Totally.
But anyway, so I just started thinking about like how really spot on that is,
Yeah, yeah. I think
after reading your book.
I would say two things that really stuck with me, and I mentioned that, like, I didn't know, I'm a civil rights attorney. I've been a civil rights attorney for like 10-15 years, and I did not know 95% of what I learned and ended up incorporating into this book before I started writing it. And two things I would say stood out to me the most. One was there was so much monumental progress towards realizing the potential of our American democracy in this Reconstruction period. It really was an opportunity for a restart where, we had these incredibly noble principles and ideas at our founding that we, did not universally actually put into practice, right? Like, we said things universally, and so that's why we're able to draw back on all men are created equal. Like, what a phenomenal idea. I so believe in that, right? And so it was such an interesting time where it's like we've had the Civil War, the Reconstruction amendments, which are the 13th, 14th, and 15th amendments, are passed, which ends slavery in America and makes African American citizens and allows them for the first time to actually be participants in the democratic experiment, right? And so for 7 or 8 years, we have Black people participating in government as voters, as politicians, representing their communities. And so we passed laws like a Civil Rights Act that outlaws discrimination in public places. Like, we do all of these things. And then as you mentioned, there was this huge wave of white supremacist domestic terrorism that quashed that. And it quashed it so effectively and so thoroughly that there wasn't anyone even to like talk about it or teach about it or or remember it, and it was just like it never happened. But then when we get to the civil rights movement in the 1950s and 60s, it's really 100 years later before we're able to try those experiments again. And so that's what's really interesting to me, is that so many of the things that we know that we all are conscious and aware of that happened in the 1960s, it wasn't the first time those things had happened. Right. It's just we didn't know, we do not know or remember that they happened before. And so that's one thing that I found really fascinating, is how repetitive the 1960s civil rights movement really was from the 1870s civil rights movement. And the other thing was how important representation is, having representation in your government. And when you don't have that representation, you can't be surprised that the outcome is not going to lean towards fairness and equality, because everyone's not represented. So the only people it's really going to work out for are going to be the people that are able to put people in power to make the rules. And and so it's like those two things I think left a really strong impression with me.
Yeah. And I think Robin Kelly calls that white lash, so like anytime there's like something that, you know, tries to make progress for people of color, there's always a period of white lash.
Yeah.
And so, and I feel like a lot of what you're talking about, another reason why this book I feel like is just so important for right now, is that all of what you're saying is so important and prescient for our current cultural moment.
Right. Right. It's like we're
And
back here again. And
yes,
that's the other thing I was realizing as I was writing it, is it's like, are we entering the third time for this cycle? Because so again, so many of the things seem so familiar.
yeah.
And
And that's across identity markers, you know, that's across like,
right.
you know, across all facets of identity, and, you know, peoples who have been historically excluded and continue to be, you know, pushed to the margins by
Right.
this structure that
Yeah.
was built to work exactly as it's working.
Right. And I feel like at some point everyone needs to ask themselves, like, do you believe in America or not?
Yeah.
You know, like, do you believe in this thing, this unique experiment that, you know, that we have? And like, can we invest in that democratic vision? Yeah.
And I feel like, I feel like too, a follow-up question is like, what is America to you? Like, how do you define America? And like, does that really match with what most people think America should be? You know, like what is freedom to you? What
Yeah.
is equality to you? And if that doesn't include everyone, then it's not really freedom and it's not really
Right.
equality. So like,
Right. That's not equality.
right.
Yeah.
And so I don't know. I think that as I was reading it, especially as I got toward the end, I was just angrily dog-earing pages and underlining passages, because I'm like, we are here again.
We're
We
here
are here
again.
exactly again. And it's
Yeah.
super frustrating.
But I feel like, you know, part of the impetus in writing the book was, if we're aware that we're here again, maybe
Yes,
we don't have to repeat the
it's the
same.
same. Yes.
Yeah. Like maybe we could look at it and be like, maybe we didn't make the right choices before. And we could, you know, we could do something different.
Right. We have the power to do something different. It's just, are
Yeah.
we going to do those things? And are the people who are seated in power going to have the same kind of spine
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
backbone,
Right.
that especially
That it
some of the
takes.
allies that you write about from the past,
Right.
are they going to make the same decisions, or are they
Yeah.
going to cower and take
Yeah.
money from people who want
Right. In a
different
piece.
things,
Right.
you know?
Yeah. And, you know, that's, you know, speaking of allies, that was also something that, I thought was just absolutely incredible, is to, you know, to see the white people,
Hmm.
you know, like when I think the way we've been taught history, like it has been very binary, you know, it's kind of been like, it's been this, you know, we're having this very slow progress towards equality for all people. But then when you look back at history, you realize that there were always people that knew the difference between right and wrong. And that was not limited to color or anything else. Like there were, you know, white people that were extremely strong in their advocacy for, you know, all men created equal means exactly that. Like these
Yeah.
rights should be conferred on everyone. Like we, you know, we're one body, we're one America, like we should be working together. And I think it's so important to remember those people and elevate, you know, them in how we see the past as well. So it's, so when we see the past, we're not just looking at, you know, the clan members, or, you know, everyone knows Robert E. Lee, everyone knows Jefferson Davis, and people know Lincoln, but I don't think, you know, people know Thaddeus Stevens or Charles Sumner or,
Somewhere. Yeah.
you know, Benjamin Butler or all these other people that were, you know, were right there, trying to make the promise of America real for everyone.
And I think that there's something really powerful in their stories, and everyone really from the past that you write about, that like, you know, I grew up learning that the right thing is almost always the hardest thing to do. You know, very seldom is the right thing the easy thing.
Hmm.
Um, and I think that that's a huge issue that we're still facing, right? Like our love of convenience, our love of money, our love of, so many of these things end up overshadowing and sort of overtaking
Yeah,
um the fact that like we should still be doing the right
the
thing,
right thing.
but the right thing is the hardest thing to do. And so if it is hard,
Right,
then it takes it just takes a certain like constitution, it,
right.
it takes a certain disposition to be willing to do that. And the folks that you write about were willing to do that um and face extreme peril, and
Yeah,
not just like losing your job, or
right.
not just like losing your seat in Congress or in the Senate or whatever, right? Like they were willing to do the right thing even though it meant maybe and likely losing their lives.
Right. It was very, very courageous. And like Charles Sumner literally got caned on the Senate floor for the positions against slavery that, that he took. And so, yeah, it took a lot of courage and stiff spine. So,
Yeah, from all parties across,
right.
like, I mean, especially like thinking specifically about your story, like Malcolm's ancestor, Cedric Johnson, like, he was, essentially executed, lynched,
Mhm.
for
Helping people
working
register
for,
to vote.
yeah, registering people to vote.
Yeah.
And that is also very similar to things that happened in the 60s.
Yeah. Yeah.
And so like, but he continued to do what he knew was right, even though it put him and his
And
family
yeah.
in jeopardy. And we hear those stories exist all throughout history, but I feel like it's like one of those, like, a good man is hard to find kind of thing,
Yeah.
like
Right.
um I just feel like, and even myself, like I take that mirror to myself too, and like, what am I doing? um but I just think it's going to take all of us willing to do the right thing, and to work together,
Right.
like you said, if we really care about America and we really care about
Our
equality and
values,
equity
yeah.
and the pursuit of life, liberty, and
Yeah,
happiness.
absolutely. And I think like what we represent in the world. And we have such a unique story and, something so special to offer. Like there are very few countries that are as multicultural as ours. We're really like the best and the brightest from everywhere want to be here and to contribute. And so it's like, how do we maximize that and, help our country live up to its greatest potential? And I think it takes like investing in all of us and hearing from all of us, and not trying to choose your voters because you want to win your seat, but offer the best ideas and let the voters pick you. So
Right. And I think it takes a shift in attitude, which I think that you just beautifully demonstrated, in that like the people who are coming here aren't taking something.
yeah,
Um they're contributing something.
great.
And so like undoing that deficit idea of like people are
Yeah,
taking,
right,
like we only have, this pie, and if
right,
I if I give up some of the piece that I have, then I'm not going to have as much as like the next, like
right.
it's not a good way to think about it. It's not an accurate or way to think about it either. So
Yeah,
um
especially when everyone other than Native Americans came from somewhere, right? And so like everyone's come from somewhere voluntarily or not, um, but we've all contributed. You know what I mean? Like however your ancestors came here, like we've contributed greatly and poured into this country. And so I think everyone that is here deserves to have their voice heard in governance and representation, and being able to help realize this vision.
it's like ownership versus responsibility and
Hmm.
obligation, right?
Hmm.
Like ownership is not, I mean, it's the capitalistic way to think about it, but that's not the best way to think about it. Like you
Yeah,
don't, it's not about ownership. It's about like we have an obligation to each other. We have an obligation to the earth. We
yeah,
have responsibility to each other. We have responsibility to the earth, um, to
community.
be the best that we can be, so that all of us um can make it and can, pursue life, liberty, and happiness.
Yeah,
Another thing that I was struck by is that like these folks aren't 70 years old. You know,
Which folks are you referring to?
the people who are serving in the Senate and the Congress, the
Oh,
politicians,
oh,
you know.
okay. You're talking about the people that served in the Reconstruction or how young
Yeah.
they were.
Yeah.
Is that what you're?
Yeah.
Yeah,
I think that that makes what you've done here by combining the history, you know, and the political sphere with young adult literature. I think that makes that really powerful, right? Because
yeah,
young people can make and do make wise decisions all the time.
great.
Um, and so, you know, allowing them the opportunity to learn about this history and to learn about, you know, who they come from,
Yeah.
um, I think could be a really powerful thing.
Absolutely. Like, I definitely wanted young people at the end of the story to feel really empowered
Mhm.
by the difference that they could make in using their voice. And the converse to that was the inspiration. And I didn't really talk about my inspiration for writing the story, but it was the Mother Emanuel massacre.
Yeah.
And, it was a teenager, that a teenage white supremacist that committed, those heinous murders and killed 9 innocent people that were praying in church. And since then, unfortunately, we've seen other incidents of teenagers that were filled with, hatred, and went out and committed atrocities. And so, it really seemed like if we could reach people, before they got to those places, and maybe it was broadening their understanding of, their compassion for people that were different from them, understanding people's stories, so that again, you're not just dealing with the stereotypes, but you're actually dealing with the people behind those stereotypes. And so that was also part of my thinking, is like, okay, if a person in that situation happened to read a book like this in school, could any of that seep inside
Mhm.
their heart and help them to reevaluate maybe what they may be hearing in other settings that are just like hate filled messages, and hate people that are different from you, or whatever else, and really just try to understand, like, okay, when you look at people that are in situations, in particular, like if you're looking at Black people, and, maybe you think that they're leeches on society, like if that's what you're being fed or something, maybe you should know more about their history, and, how, what has been taken from them, and all the ways that they haven't been able to be a part of their own governance, and how that's resulted in, a lot of situations that they didn't want or create, and maybe
Yeah.
just create a little more compassion
And hopefully maybe empathy.
and empathy. Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly.
At least, at the very least, understanding, you
Yeah, and
know.
understanding, right? And it's like, okay, yeah. So trying to bridge those divides, and reduce that vitriolic, like,
Mhm.
hatred, just because you don't know the people, you've maybe never met someone like this before, and so all you know is what you've been told about them.
And that there are like more productive ways to like, you know, deal with your anger and
Yeah,
like, you know,
yeah,
um,
yeah.
but yeah, yeah, all of those things. Um, I was wondering, um, if you were inspired by Octavia Butler and Kindred at all for this story, because as I was reading it, Kindred's one of my all-time favorite books.
Oh, yeah.
And I was like, this is so much like, you know, sort of like going
Right.
back to the past, getting pulled back all the time, and coming back and meeting with ancestors and not wanting to mess it up so that you know, still end up existing, and sort of being caught in difficult situations and trying to figure out like how to navigate those situations as someone who isn't really from that time, but like
Right,
came out of that time because
right,
of, you know,
right.
I was just curious if you were inspired by her in that story at all.
I think Kindred is absolutely amazing, and I'm flattered anytime I hear that comparison. And so yeah, there's definitely I think some strong parallels in the storytelling styles between Black Was the Ink and Kindred, and for all the reasons that you mentioned. Some a couple of places where I feel like it differs in important ways is Kindred, as far as I'm aware, the protagonist went to a fictitious slave plantation that was like representative
Mm.
of plantations, but I don't know if she met real people. And I think that so I feel like Kindred gives you like an important like insight into that experience from being a modern person, because I think it's pretty unimaginable for
Mhm.
like any of us to think about being enslaved, you know, not having bodily autonomy, not having right, not having that, you know, not having freedom of choice, or I'm not trying to throw out buzzwords, I promise. But you know, just all of the things that it's so unfathomable to think about. And so I think it's so important that Kindred told the story in that way, because you could see it like, if this was me, like how would I, what
Mhm.
would I do? How would I react? It's terrifying. As opposed to other slave stories and slave narratives that are all set in that time period. I think that you can like believe a little more, because that's what they knew. That's what those characters knew. And so you're just kind of seeing them in the world that they knew versus us when that's not the world that we know. Um, but but my story, you know, it very much intersects with real
Mhm.
people, you
Mhm.
know, like the first Black members of Congress. And you know, there's so many people that you meet that you've probably heard about, but probably not in the context that they're introduced in the book. So Frederick Douglass, everyone's heard of Frederick Douglass,
Yeah.
but few people know that he was put in charge of Freedmen's Bank,
Right.
which was a, you know, a bank that the government created for Black people to be able to deposit their money for the first time, because you know, when you're enslaved, you don't really have money, and so you don't have need for a bank. And I do always like to point out that it was 4.4 million African Americans that were liberated at the end of the Civil War with the passage of the 13th Amendment, just to emphasize like what a monumental number that is. Like
Mhm.
4.4 million people is a whole
Mhm.
lot of people that had to figure out how to adjust to the responsibilities of freedom, and starting out with nothing, because they were not paid wages when they were enslaved. And so you see Frederick Douglass in that role. And then Sojourner Truth, I think, is a name that most people are familiar with. But again, you see her in a very different role, where she's advocating and meeting with President Grant. And it's like, wow, I didn't know she met with President Grant. That's so cool. Yeah, but met with President Grant and tried to convince him to give land grants to the Black people emancipated from slavery, very similar to the Homestead Act land grants that were given to white Americans to settle the West,
Mhm.
that Black people weren't eligible for because of their race. And so, you know, right from the very beginning, you see the disparity in wealth and how it starts to take root, you know, from advantages that white people were able to get by nature of the fact that they were represented in government. And so they're going to get the benefits of that representation. And that is not something that Black people had for most of American history. And Harriet Tubman is another one that everyone knows Harriet Tubman, but not as many people know that she was heavily involved in the women's suffrage movement.
Right.
And so I just kind of wanted to like bring in different people that, you know, most of the people in the book I think are going to be names that you've probably never heard of, but I also wanted to just kind of show these other facets. So that's one way that I think it is different. And then the other thing is, I can't think of any stories, and maybe I'll come across one at one point, but there are a number of different stories that do explore the slave experience,
Mhm.
and there are just so few stories that explore the beginnings of freedom
Right.
for Black people. And so that is what I really wanted to focus on, is like, okay, you know, I get it, for hundreds of years they were enslaved, got it.
Right.
But then it's like, but what does this freedom mean,
Mhm.
and what do people do with it? And what can you just even, can you imagine that moment, right, where it's like, you've been enslaved your whole life, your grandmother, your mom, your grandmother, like all these generations have wanted freedom but have not, been able to grasp it, and you're that first one. Like, I can't even imagine the type of joy and, the way that families were trying to reunite with one another. And that's not something that I touched on as much as I probably should have, because that was such an important part of the emancipation, was like all of these families that had been separated through slavery. And the Freedmen's Bureau had a reunification arm to it, where it was trying to reunite families, like babies that had been separated from mothers, and all of these things, husbands and wives, and like to actually be able to choose your family and to be together, again. And so to be able to earn a wage from your labor,
Right.
like that's what did not exist before. And so I feel like it's so important for people to really think about what that freedom meant, to be able to practice your religion, right? Like, in so many communities, Black people were prohibited from practicing their religion because, correctly so, the plantation owners knew that they were using those spaces often to rebel
Yes.
against their enslavement and their oppression. And so it was like, well, we're just gonna, not let them get together outside of an overseer's eye. But finally, like, you can practice your faith, you can build your church, you can build your community, you can own your own house, or
You can read.
you can read. Yeah, like that had been denied them, an education. And so that's where you start seeing these just a building of like all of these Black schools. Like, so many historically Black colleges and universities were founded in this exact period, and they're still here today, like still educating hundreds of thousands and millions of Black people every year. And so when I was naming the things that really stuck with me, that's I would say that's a third thing, is how many institutions that we still benefit from today had their genesis in the Reconstruction era, and we don't even think about it, we don't even connect the dots. I went to Howard Law School, and I didn't even think about it in that way, that my school was founded in 1870. You know what I mean? Like, that's literally the first thing these Black people did,
Right.
getting out of slavery. Slavery ended 1865. They were like, we're creating colleges. And you know what I mean? And we're having higher education, and we're going to strive to reach our fullest potential. And like all the things that people told us we weren't, we are, and we're finally have the opportunity to manifest that. So yeah, so I really I feel like it's such a special moment to to think about and to focus on, whether you're Black or white or anything else, just to like put yourself in those shoes and think about what that freedom would mean for you.
Right. And then like the fact that we are here today and there are still structural like forces that will threaten to take it all away, just like the eminent domain issue with Malcolm and his family, right? Like
so many of the same battles.
Yeah.
So many of the states, that have passed laws to make it more difficult to vote. It's like, we're doing this again.
I know. And I don't want us to like, get back. I feel like we talked a lot about that. And I think it's important to talk about. But I think you're right that there are moments and images of hope, and that just the incredible accomplishments and the fortitude and just the perseverance is also important to focus on, because it's easy just to like put blinders on and just focus on all of the horrible things. But at the same time, like there are these things that are so good that came out of such horrible times, and hopefully that will be the same thing for us, in this pretty terrible time.
You have to stay hopeful. I don't feel like there's any other alternative, because if you stop hoping, then like that change will never come. And so you've got to stay hopeful and try to inspire others and find allies and work together and see your commonality. And I I think we'll get there.
Well, on that hopeful note, I mean, we could stay and talk to each other all day. I know we could,
Yeah.
but we shouldn't. And so, um, we, I just wanted to say thank you so much, for joining me, for being here, for just this delightful conversation of important things. And I just really appreciate your time. And I really loved the book.
Thank you. Thank you so much for reaching out to me. It was absolute pleasure talking with you. And yeah, thank you for everything you do to just highlight different experiences in America and, help bring our country closer.
Thanks so much.